Hi, everyone. Welcome to Love Bites, where horror and romance make out. This is Fear, Desire, are kissing cousins, and sometimes they do more than that. In this panel, authors who thrive at the intersection of horror and romance talk about building chemistry amid carnage, using intimacy, heightened tension, and exploring how vulnerability in love makes characters more breakable and readable. Whether it's Gothic obsession, monstrous attraction, or doomed soulmates, come find out what happens when the heart races for more than one reason. Ooh. So I'm Elizabeth Suggs, HWA member, and I'm moderating this panel, and we'll just kind of go down the line. So, Brianna, do you want to start introducing yourself?
Sure. Love going first. So like she said, I'm Brianna Malotki. I've been an HWA member for a couple of years and I ran the Seattle chapter the last 2 years. I'm heavily published poetry-wise with a few short stories and a couple of horror poetry collections, one of which is this blend of horror and romance. So I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah. And Brianna, and I guess I didn't really mention it, but I'm
Oh yeah.
co-owners of Collective Tales Publishing. And Brianna is in our Darkness 101 book and
Yeah.
Darkness 102. So, and you're just in a bunch of our
Yeah.
books. So it's really
Yeah.
exciting. Yeah. Hey, Jonathan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Jonathan Reddock, and I'm co-owner of Collective Tales Publishing with Elizabeth, and I write a lot of horror flash fiction, and a lot of my stories are not technically romance because all the sticklers that are so pedantic and annoying, no offense to those of you on the panel, that they're not technically romance because they don't have a happy ending, and maybe we'll get into that. But I like to write stories about romance. I'm just gonna say that a lot because I think it's just like a fun theme to play with. Um, and I also do a lot of poetry too, dark poetry, or spooky or dark fantasy. So, and I write other genres too, including cutesy romance sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, what you're describing is like love stories, right? Or tragedies, technically, right? Some stories are
I
tragedies,
mean,
but they have
yeah, I
also
guess. I
love
mean,
elements.
I wouldn't really call them tragedies, but I think technically they fit the definition.
Yeah. Okay, Michaela, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Michaela Ray. I'm actually kind of a newer member of the Horror Writers Association. So, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from Brianna, I actually joined this year. I write feminist dark fiction. I also write some poetry on the side, and am published in a few anthologies. So, excited to be here.
Oh, lots of anthologies. Collective Humanity with us, and soon to be Darkness 102 as well. And yeah, and also all of you, well, Jonathan and Michaela and I are also members, and we've had stories in the anthology of the League of Utah Writers Romance chapter. So it's kind of a blend of that.
I think I
Okay,
have a poem in one of those as well,
you may. Is it
or
the
a short story. But yeah,
yeah. Okay, I can't remember. So it's probably in is it Second Chance or I'd have to
it's
look.
it's one of those.
Sorry. But yeah, Brianna, you've been everywhere. You like sowed your wild oats in every single writing thing. It's
I got
awesome.
got that ADHD.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, I hope not,
Okay.
because I think everybody on this panel has it.
Yeah, well, be proud and loud about it. Okay, so I'm gonna just start going down questions and I'll just pick on you guys unless you have a really, exciting answer, you have to do it. But what do horror and romance have in common at their core, and how do you lean into that when you're overlapping it in writing? So we'll start with Michaela this time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that horror and romance have a lot of similarities, specifically in the type of fiction that I write, feminist dark fiction. there are a lot of similar themes when it comes to love and horror. So, it could be anything from, a dark night, taking a walk through like a starry night, and then, oh no, it takes a turn and it's actually, a scary, like horror-filled scene. Um, and they both play together hand in hand really well, and you can kind of play with that balance a lot. So I think it's really fun to kind of think through those types of elements, while you are crafting your story.
Nice. Thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's really about a heightened sense of, or heightened emotional states, I guess you could say. So like passion. And I know you've talked about this a lot in your romance and horror, what do you call it? Presentation, workshop,
It's
writing
the
workshop.
workshop. Yeah.
But yeah, and I think when I write stories that mix both, there's you got like, oh, I'm like so obsessed with this person. I'm so into them or whatever. And then it's also like, I'm so angry and murdery, or whatever. So there's just these heightened senses of like just peak emotional, I don't know, craziness, I guess.
Nice. And Brianna?
Yeah, I would say with horror and romance, right, they're both gonna invoke these heart racing moments. Either you're creating something really scary and the reader's like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen next? Or you're replicating that feeling of falling in love somehow, where your heart's racing and you're not sure what's gonna happen next. And for me, that's where it kind of overlaps and where you can do twists, especially if you're merging them together, right? Like with my one poetry book, it's all about these very obvious red flags in supernatural creatures, and like, why would you fall in love with a witch who's doing human sacrifice right in front of you? So, kind of like combining those elements and setting the scene with how to evoke those strong emotions is where it kind of overlaps for me.
Yeah, I really like what you brought up the these different emotions because right, it's like for me, I think about like the horror and romance using like these different like very similar sensory details, right? Like you're gonna have
Mm,
goosebumps whether someone's about to attack you and you're hiding
yeah.
from them, or when this guy comes up and touches you, right? But who knows? Maybe he's a monster.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's I really like yeah, the sensory as well as like the atmospheric, you can really blend those.
Yeah.
But okay, so here's one that Brandon, I believe you also are part of this too, but we're going to talk about erotica sort of stuff. Okay.
I am, yeah.
So I know, right? Yeah, everyone here has written some kind of sex scene, so I think this is a good one. So, do you approach writing a sex scene differently when it's situated in a horror context? And if you have, like, how do you navigate the arousal and the dread in the same space? And we'll start with Jonathan this time.
Me, the one who knows the least about it.
Yep.
I mean, I wrote my first erotica story last year, kind of just at a writing retreat, and I think it turned out pretty good, but it was not a spooky one. So maybe I should try a spooky one because I've read a couple spooky ones, and I think for me, I'm gonna confess something here. It's a little confusing. I think my body doesn't know how to react. Like it doesn't know which chemicals it's supposed to be releasing where and where the blood is supposed to be flowing because uh well, a lot of times it's like this is like messed up. This is like truly not a cool situation. So I almost feel like a sense of guilt, I think, also. Like if there's like a serial killer and they're like, "Ooh, we're gonna have sex," and it's like, "No, you're a bad person. This is not cool. I don't like this at all." But my body might be telling me a different story, so I don't know. I think it's a weird sensation to mix erotica and horror because uh like with romance there's like this sense of anxiety when you're in love and you don't know where things are going to go and you're like, oh, I hope they like me back, and then there's a different sense of dread, like anxiety with like horror, and so it's just like it's like swirling up all your emotions in a way that's just I'm just like not used to.
But that's what makes it complicated and amazing, right? That's what I think that there's a delicate balance, right, of towing the line over because there is a lot of toxic relationship stuff that I don't really like writing about, but still having that dread and that fear. Maybe it's not the two characters, maybe it's everything outside. They're having sex while,
Well, there's like a
this murderer is
weird
about to get him. Yeah.
there's like a weird trend,
Mhm.
like there's like two conflicting trends in like bookstagram or like in reader world where like the perfect man is my boyfriend from this book. But then like I notice a lot of times the women are attracted to these really toxic characters and like in real life they'd be like, "Oh
Mhm.
no, this guy's horrible. I would not date him. I wouldn't want to know him." But like, "Oh, he's so romantic in this book." Like so it's like, we're a weird double standard.
Eh. It's the safety, right? Okay, Brianna, why don't you tell us your thoughts?
So the question is writing erotica in romance versus writing it in horror, right?
Yeah, and
Okay.
like how do you navigate
So
like that arousal and the dread in the same space?
yeah, so I will say just to be upfront, I think all of my horror erotica pieces, um, I don't know how to describe them, but so in my romance stuff, it's very sweet. I say it's Hallmark. It's but with sex. They're all open door. And so I think with my horror parts, it's going back to that sensory and what is most important in that moment. And so in my horror stuff, there is blood play, there's knife elements, there's a lot more risky things. And it's a lot about touch and scent and mm, maybe not as much dialogue that I would incorporate into the more pure romance, non-horror stuff. Right? That's a lot more about talking to the partner you're with and making sure that consent is given. And there's a lot more thinking for me that goes into my romance scenes than necessarily in my horror. So it's always
Mm.
that kind of like, okay, checklist, da, 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 da. But yeah, that
Yeah.
sensory bit is the most distinguishing for me and what is important.
Have you read The Vampire Queen? It's like straight smut. But the reason why I bring it up is that it kind of describes what you're saying, where it's like
Yeah.
there is this like the guy, he's not necessarily a bad guy, but he's like this ancient
Yeah.
vampire and he's like, taking blood
Yeah.
from this like half. Yeah, so like and there's
Hmm.
this weird like there is this weird power struggle, but like,
Yeah.
they kind of find themselves and they get
Well, and
really
there's a
aroused.
lot of terms that overlap. And so one of the things I'm actually working on with another romance author is what's the difference between erotic horror, horror erotica, and horror romance. And
Oh.
so that kind of has been making me think a little bit deeper about, okay, we have horror romance, but how's it different than horror erotica? And I think that kind of like your plot choices and everything can kind of help separate it. But yeah,
And there's also
it's a
like
lot.
Mhm.
paranormal romance too, which is like a whole different.
Hmm.
Yeah. And paranormal romance can blend into these things, right? Like that
Yeah.
I
vampire
think
queen is very much like based in it's
Mhm.
borderline like toxic, but it's still
Right.
happy and lovey at the same time. I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe that's the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, does the sex scene, is it central to the plot, right? So then that
Yeah.
kind of helps deviate,
It's
like, okay, is it
definitely
actually a romance story or is it
oh, it's
what?
smut. Yeah, it's smut. Yeah, if you took the sex out, there would be no I mean, there's like a little
Right.
bit of the
Yeah.
story, but yeah. Okay, and Michaela, do you have thoughts?
Yeah. So when I'm blending horror and romance, I kind of view it as like love is just another kind of like possession almost. um, so horror can possess you and love can kind of possess you, right? And so drawing on again those similarities how your defenses are lowered in both situations. And when it takes a turn into, more of the smut kind of area, you look at things like Dracula, for example, and how they were able to accomplish both the horror alongside, romantic elements. Um, and a lot of other novels have done that too, really successfully. Thinking about like, oh, maybe they're a monster, but only I can tame them. Those kinds of things, right?
We all want
So
that.
so again, like the other panelists have said, a lot of those emotions and playing with those emotions and kind of not being afraid to go too far, with the horror and then back again the other way with the romance because there are a lot of similarities that you can tie in together.
Yeah, and Michaela just sent me over her paranormal romance story, and it's essentially ghost sex that happens, and it's
Yeah.
very steamy, very great. But there is like, and I haven't looked at the final edits yet. I apologize. I'll go through it now. But essentially, in the beginning, it does like we don't really know what's happening. Like, is it a bad thing or a good thing? And then it slowly kind of goes into this, like, oh, they actually really love each other and they have sex and it's great. And I don't know. We had to have a happily ever after because it's the romance chapter, and we can get into that in the next
Mhm.
question. But yeah, like because the original, I liked the ending that you had for the original one, but just to fit the theme, we made it
I
happy.
thought
But
the original was great, but yeah, I think I
yeah.
might have been the one that was like, wait, this isn't a happy ending. Maybe I
Yeah.
should have said something.
Well, and so that kind of brings us into the next one. So, just to kind of describe to the audience, because maybe some of you don't really know much about romance, but you know a lot about horror. There are diehard fans in romance that who believe that romance to be strictly romance, there's very specific rules that you have to follow. You have to have a happily ever after or a happy for now. You have to there's a whole list, but essentially, it has to have yeah, the happily
The
ever after
love has to be
happy
like
for
the main part of the
oh
plot,
yes,
right?
that love has to be the main part of the plot. If you pull the love out and it falls apart, that's the romance story. And we kind of joked around about like smut versus steamy romance. Like if you took two different stories and you took the sex out of the story, if the story collapses, it's probably a smut. Whereas like if you pull it out, maybe it's a shorter book, but like it's still really strong, it would be a steamy romance because like I know this is like slightly different, but fourth wing people joke about being super sexy. You could pull the sex out of the fourth wing, and I like it, but you could pull that out, and it would still be a story, a very strong story with a very strong like a plot for it. So it's kind of interesting with that. And then love stories, right, are ones that you may see a lot where maybe it doesn't have the same rules. People don't really care that much. That you could have a love story, whether or not, like, there's a lot of things you don't have to fit into these rules, but there are certain romance readers, if you say it's a romance, they'll like die on that hill of like, it doesn't have a happily ever after. Oh, okay, gonna throw this away. So, take that as you will. I feel like a lot of horror romance, in my experience, tends to be more love story. Like it's just easier to have it be like a well, there's not a happy ever after, but or there's romance, but like the horror is the main focus. Like when you're blending it, it's a little bit easier not to hit the same rules. But yeah, so kind of giving in that. Do you guys have like, do you prefer writing romance versus love stories in your own horror stories? And also just when you're just doing strictly a love or a romance story?
I mean,
And yeah,
oh, sorry. I was just like, I was
that's
asking
okay.
you thoughts.
You're
Sure, you can
ready.
start.
I shouldn't jump in. Sorry, Lila, you have a system or something, whatever. I
It's
was
fine.
just like, oh, this is the topic I came to talk about because I think about it a lot. Yeah. So for the romance chapter, I had to write a romance story and I had to have a happy ending, even though the happy ending is he committed suicide to be with a ghost. But
But they're
whatever.
together now. It's happy.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But like, here's the thing. So what I don't like about the romance thing is like you already know the ending, and I feel like that sort of takes away from it. I get that some people want to be comforted and know that it's going to be happy. But one of the things that you like about horror is you don't know if it's going to be happy or sad at the end. Like sometimes nobody dies in a horror story and they survive. Sometimes everybody but the virgin survives. And so like you don't know who's going to live and who's going to die. And you don't know if the villain is going to die or if he's going to go on. So like there's even though you kind of have some expectations with horror, I feel like you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Whereas with traditional or strictly defined romance, you do. And I think that sort of, for me, makes it seem there's less tension. But at the same time, I love superhero movies and they always win. So I guess I can't judge.
You watch so many superhero movies. There was one night that Jonathan told Michaela and me about his night out. Well, his night in, but it was like 6 hours
There's more than
of
that.
watching superhero.
I
More
Nice.
than
watched
Yeah.
because there's a new Superman movie coming out, and so I had to prepare. And since I've been stuck in on my couch, I couldn't go anywhere. I watched Man of Steel, and then I was like, well, I gotta watch the sequel, Batman versus Superman, and those are both like 3 hours long. And then I watched Justice League, which was like 2 hours. And then there's another version of Justice League, so I had to watch that, and that one was 4 hours long for some reason. So I watched them all straight, and it was not a great use of my time, probably, but because I've seen them before.
well, we keep bringing it up, so maybe
And I
it's
know how they
relevant
end.
somehow. Yeah, I love romance. It gets really romances for me get really, really stressful sometimes because the relationship tension, that stuff, like when things go wrong, I get really stressed out. I've always had it, even as a kid. Maybe I'm messed up. I don't know. But knowing that the romance is going to work out in the end, I like need that where I'm going to break because I used to read tons. I love them still, but I went through a phase where I read a bunch of Russian classics. And it like, I think it broke me just a teensy tiny bit because then after I read Jane Eyre and I was happy with how that story ended.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
that's how far I had gone. I went like a whole year of reading Russian classics and then Jane Eyre was happy to
Yeah.
me.
So I will say, I think it's just different readerships, right? And sometimes they're going to overlap and sometimes they won't. Like under my romance pen name, my tagline that my publisher came up with is like, no cheating, no cliffhangers, happily ever after guaranteed. And it's on all of my books with them. And so like Jonathan said, you know there's going to be a happily ever after. You might not know how they get there, but it's that no risk. And so in horror, you're like, yeah, there's romance, but you have no idea what's going to happen.
It's pretty
They
stressful
could
sometimes.
die, yeah. So invoking those intense feelings through stress.
Yes. Which is good and bad, depends on what people want to
Yeah.
read, right? And Michaela,
Hmm.
do you have thoughts?
Yeah, just going along with what we were talking about with the happily ever after or happy for now. Um, I didn't think I would struggle with that as much as I did, because I've written a lot of like love stories and love elements in things that I've written. Um, there's always a love interest, right? And so I was like, oh, I can totally write this paranormal romance easy. Um, but yeah, I think that's why I fit in with the horror writers a little better because it always has a really dark turn. It has a crazy twist, right? Those are the things that we love in horror writing. Um, and so it was a really big challenge for me to, you know, tie it up nicely with a neat little ending. And I will say again, you look at those romance stories. I mean, even like The Notebook, which is like a really popular one that people have watched, and I didn't really watch it until like I'm not going to lie, like 2 years ago, because it was
What?
so popular, and I was like, I don't want to watch this because it just sounds like romantic trash. But then you watch it, and especially for me,
And
for
it
the
is
first
romantic trash.
time, um, that relationship is very toxic. Like if
Yeah.
you go back and watch it right now, you're like, wow, they're actually really toxic to each other. And you can see how a lot of these like horror elements, if you took it a little bit farther, right?
Yeah.
it could definitely tie into horror nicely. The only thing again is that eventually somehow they end up with like, this happy ending where anyway. So yeah, I think if you're interested in writing horror romance, I would say that's a big challenge to it. If you're gonna stick with the traditional definition that we've kind of discussed today.
Yeah, but I like if you what you mentioned because if you are struggling, you should just one thing I do in my romance horror workshop is I'll show these different movie clips and be like, okay, now the Notebook, let's switch it. How can this be a horror? Now Breakfast at Tiffany's, how can that be a horror? The ending scene, and or like making a horror like Freddy versus Jason. Let's make that into an MLM, right? Um, make it into a love story. Just this
Multi-level
lover
marketing?
stripe. Yeah. No, well, it's I guess maybe you're not supposed to say that, but it's like man on man, like the man love, it's Pride Month,
Oh,
two men
say
loving
man
each
on
other.
man. Gay
Yes, man on
romance?
man love. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah, doing that I think can kind of help you find your place, especially if you're more used to writing in horror and you want to learn how to write romance. Kind of shifting it a little bit might help a little. Okay, so we have about 6 minutes. So I want to get to one more question, then we can kind of talk about where people can find you. So, how do horror elements help reveal deeper truths about your characters' relationships? We kind of already touched a little bit about this, but so Brianna, why don't you go first?
So how do horror elements help us with our characters? Sorry.
Yeah, help reveal the deeper truths about our characters and their relationships.
I would say I feel like in horror, there's a lot more honesty, right? Like if you're getting scared, you're in that moment, like you have to make a lot of quick decisions. And I think that sort of helps you. I, I'm trying to figure out what I want to say.
It's okay, we can
Like,
come back.
yeah,
Do you want me to come back?
yeah.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so Michaela, do you want to do it? Do you want to answer this?
Yeah, I would say, kind of thinking about we all have skeletons in our closet, right? And so you can really show that through your writing when you're looking at your character. Maybe you could play with the fact that the romance is separate from the horror, and the person is like a serial killer, and then they come home and they're this upstanding figure, and nobody has any inclination that they're off doing these horrible things or that they're even capable of it, right? And that's kind of a trope that we've seen a lot in horror. And so just kind of fleshing out the details of that character, like what are they like behind closed doors? Are they different around different groups of people? Do they have a day job where they kind of go
Ooh.
about their business and continue doing what they do? I mean, to bring up another television show, Dexter, right?
Mhm.
Does that career that they're doing help aid them in, their career, their other career, serial killing, right? And so it's kind of fun to play with those things, and you can kind of learn more about the character and, why are they interested in, blood pathology in Dexter's case? Well, it's because he's actually interested in tracking down terrible people to kill. So, yeah, I think it's, you can definitely flesh out the characters in a lot of fun and interesting ways.
Nice. Jonathan, do you want to go?
Sure. So I think like with horror, a lot of times it's you can be your true self, the character. I mean, not me, I'm not a psycho, but like
Sure,
lawlessness,
sure.
meaning like if there's no law, if it's like the purge or something where you can do whatever you want and you don't care about the consequences, what are you going to do? And it's usually something awful. Uh, like I recently watched Hollow Man with Kevin Bacon from like the 90s. It's like the Invisible Man story. And it's like I'm gonna admit, like, I thought, oh, what would I do? Like, I would think I'm an upstanding citizen. I wouldn't do anything inappropriate if I was an invisible man. And I'm like, gosh, I'm glad I'm not because that seems like a really terrible temptation to do all kinds of bad things, steal and probably not murder, but maybe go somewhere you shouldn't go. No, you know what? I would not do that. That on the record.
Yeah, you'd go to all the girls'
But
locker rooms.
I'm like self-aware enough to know like I don't want that temptation because having these constraints from society and judgment, peering eyes, it controls us in a way. And I think in horror, your Michael Myers and your whoever Dracula's, they don't care about consequences. They just do what they want.
Nice. Okay, Brianna, do you have some
Yes.
thoughts?
So they pretty much covered what my brain was trying to compute, which was putting your characters in these situations helps you figure out what they would do, what would be true for them. So that was, yeah.
Nice. Well, we just have a few minutes left. Oh, Jonathan, did you have something you want to say?
Oh, well, I did have a thought because I was thinking about
Hmm.
Michaela's book that I've read a lot of, at least in one of her earlier drafts, and I know she's like at changing it all, but it's like almost, I think it's, what did she call it? Feminist, whatever,
Feminist dark
fiction.
fiction.
Feminist dark
I
fiction,
like
yeah.
that.
Because like I was thinking about your story, your book. It's almost like a reverse romance because it's about like the dissolution of a marriage of this guy who's like becoming evil or whatever, and the holidays that they endure together. And I'm like, what would you call that? What's the opposite of a romance that's also really scary?
Or
You call
toxicity.
it you call it
Michaela, let me
feminist
read your
dark
book.
fiction.
Feminist science fiction. Yes, that's what you call it.
But well, what I like to do is I like to write feminist stories too, where a, the female character is free from society's shackles to treat men probably the way that they deserve. Like I wrote a story where this guy hits on a girl, like he buys a woman a drink at a bar, and she's like, "Oh, okay, thanks," and then he goes in and tries to kiss her, and so she like bites his nose off, and she spits it out into a pickle jar where they keep all of the ripped off parts from the offensive men, like the ears and the eyes and the whatever's hands. But
Nice. I love that. Okay, we have just a few minutes left, so I do want everyone who's been watching to be able to find everyone. So why don't we start with Brianna? Tell us where people can find you, and if you have any books you want to like showcase or anything like that.
Oh, yeah. So once again, I'm Brianna Malatke. You can see my name in the little thing. That is my handle for everything. Very boring. Yeah, you can find, I have my Lost Cherry book. Oh, it's terrible by computer screen. But that is romance and horror. So you can get it pretty much everywhere, I think. Barnes& and Noble, big one. Um, yeah, I'll be at a bunch of events this fall.
Oh yeah, and everyone, I mean, and yeah, well, also you won't be at StokerCon this year, right?
No,
Okay,
I
well, we'll
will
be
not.
there in spirit, so if anyone asks, you'll be there. Okay, cool. And then Jonathan?
yes, oh, for less than a minute. So I have a couple of love stories in this book, Darkness 101, which is really good. You should check it out. And I'm on Instagram as Jonathan Reddock Author, and our website is ctbfiction.com.
Okay. And Michaela?
I'm Michaela Ray. I am published. Easiest way to find me is, in a local bookstore or on Amazon.com. My website is vstudioutah.org, and I'm on all social platforms as McCae MCAERAE. Yeah.
Great. Well, and you can find me, Elizabeth Suggs Author, on Instagram and Facebook and everything. Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate you watching. Bye.